It was a quiet Thursday evening at Mel's Diner, a small, old-fashioned restaurant tucked away off a highway in the middle of nowhere. The place had been around since the 1950s, a time capsule with its checkered floors, neon signs, and chrome bar stools. Jenny, the night shift waitress, had grown used to the eerie stillness that blanketed the diner after 10 p.m., but tonight felt different. As the clock struck midnight, Jenny was the only one there. She had taken the job for extra cash and was used to the long, lonely nights. The occasional truck driver or traveler would stop by for a late-night bite, but most of the time she was left alone with her thoughts, the faint hum of the neon sign outside, and the low crackle of the radio playing in the background. But that night, something gnawed at her, an unsettling feeling that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The diner seemed colder than usual, the shadows in the corners darker, as if they were creeping closer with every passing second. At around 12:30 a.m., the bell above the door jingled. A man walked in, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, his coat drenched from the rain that had started pouring moments earlier. Jenny welcomed him with a smile, though her gut instinct told her something was off. The man didn't respond. He simply nodded and took a seat at the far end of the diner, in the darkest booth. "Coffee?" Jenny asked, trying to shake the eerie feeling creeping up her spine. The man didn't answer. He just stared ahead, not even looking at the menu. Jenny noticed his hands, pale, almost ghostly white, tapping on the table, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to echo through the otherwise silent diner. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it down in front of him, her hands trembling slightly. As she stepped back, she glanced at the man's reflection in the mirror behind the counter. Her heart skipped a beat. His reflection wasn't there. The booth was empty in the mirror, but when she looked back at the table, he was still sitting there, unmoving. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what she had seen, or hadn't seen. Was it a trick of the light? The flickering neon sign outside? She quickly turned her back to the customer, feeling an overwhelming need to call her boss, Mark, who was always on call in case something went wrong. As she picked up the phone behind the counter, the diner's lights flickered, and the radio went silent. The only sound was the patter of rain against the windows and the steady drip from a leak in the roof. "Hello, Mark? You there?" Jenny whispered into the phone, her voice shaky. No answer. Just static. Suddenly, the bell above the door rang again. Another man entered, but this one was different. His clothes were torn, and he looked like he had been walking for miles in the rain. He seemed disoriented and frantic, his eyes wide with fear. He approached the counter, eyes darting to the man sitting in the booth. Don't go near him," the second man stammered, barely able to get the words out. "He's not real." Jenny felt the air grow heavy around her, like the diner itself was suffocating her. "What do you mean?" she whispered. "I was on the highway, saw him walking in the middle of the road," the man said, panting as if he'd been running for hours. "I swerved to avoid him and crashed, but when I got out, he was gone. Then I saw him here." Jenny's blood ran cold. The diner seemed to grow darker, as if the walls were closing in on her. She glanced toward the booth again, but the man in the hat had vanished. Only the steaming cup of coffee remained, untouched. Without warning, the second man collapsed. His body hit the floor with a sickening thud, eyes wide open but lifeless. Jenny screamed, stumbling backward, knocking over a stack of plates. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the adrenaline surging through her veins. She ran to the front door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had been locked from the outside. She turned, her eyes darting around the diner. The once familiar place felt foreign, hostile, like something out of a nightmare. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him again. The man in the hat was standing in the reflection of the diner's window, staring at her, but when she turned around, no one was there. Her mind was spiraling, trapped in a loop of terror. The man's face, his pale hands, the empty reflection, None of it made sense. She felt as if she were losing her grip on reality. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life again, but instead of music, a voice whispered, "He never leaves." The lights flickered one final time, and when they came back on, everything was still. The second man's body was gone, as if he had never been there. The coffee cup was empty, the booth completely vacant. Jenny was alone again, but the silence was far from comforting. She never spoke about that night, not even to Mark when he came in the next morning and found her pale, shaking, and unable to explain why the entire night had vanished from her memory. But every time she worked the night shift after that, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was watching her. On the outskirts of a sleepy town in rural Ohio, there stood a diner, Lenny's 24-hour diner, a place where truckers, night owls, and insomniacs came to fill their bellies. The diner itself was unremarkable, with its neon sign flickering faintly under the moonlight and the occasional hum of distant highway traffic. But what made this diner special, or perhaps cursed, was what happened after midnight. For years, rumors swirled about the strange occurrences at Lenny's during the late hours, but no one ever had proof until one fateful night. It was 11:45 p.m. when Sam, a college student returning home after a long day of studying at a nearby university, pulled into the diner's parking lot. His car was running low on gas and he was starving. The cold air outside bit at his skin, and the warmth emanating from the diner was a welcome sight. As he stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed softly. The place was practically empty except for a waitress behind the counter and a lone customer seated at the far end. Sam shrugged off the eeriness of the quiet and took a seat at the counter. "Can I get you anything?" The waitress Doris asked in a monotone voice, her face pale and tired. "Just a coffee and a burger," Sam replied, glancing around the diner. There was something unsettling about the place, almost as if time had stopped. The lone customer at the far end, a gaunt man wearing a heavy coat, never looked up from his meal. He just sat there, silently chewing, his eyes hidden in the shadow of his hat. As Sam sipped his coffee, the clock above the counter struck midnight. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. The diner grew colder, and the lights flickered. Sam glanced at Doris, expecting her to react, but she simply continued cleaning a glass, her expression blank. Suddenly, a soft scraping noise echoed from the back of the diner. Sam turned, his heart pounding. The man in the heavy coat remained still, unmoved by the sound. Sam leaned forward, straining to hear. The noise grew louder, closer. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. "Did you hear that?" Sam asked nervously, but Doris ignored him. The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft whispering, inaudible at first but growing louder with each passing second. Sam's palms began to sweat as he strained to make out the words. They sounded like multiple voices overlapping, too many to comprehend. Out of nowhere, the man in the heavy coat slowly lifted his head, revealing gaunt, hollow eyes that seemed too large for his face. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Sam's stomach churned as the whispers seemed to surround him, pressing into his ears, making his head spin. "What the hell is going on here?" Sam stammered, rising from his seat. Doris, still emotionless, simply pointed toward the back of the diner. "It's coming," she whispered, her voice filled with dread for the first time. Before Sam could ask what she meant, the scraping resumed, this time louder and accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and from the shadows emerged a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs seemed disjointed, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Its face was a grotesque mask of human features stretched too thin, and its eyes, cold, dead, and empty, locked onto Sam. Paralyzed with fear, Sam tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure's body twisted and contorted unnaturally as it approached him, dragging its elongated fingers across the floor. The whispers grew louder, now forming a coherent chant. "Stay. Forever. Stay." Sam's mind raced. He had to get out, but the exit seemed miles away. Doris remained still, her eyes wide with fear. She knew what was coming, but she had accepted her fate long ago. "Run!" she finally screamed, snapping Sam out of his trance. In a blind panic, Sam bolted toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. But just as his fingers grazed the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The creature was right behind him, its breath cold against his neck. With no other choice, Sam ducked under a table, hoping the darkness would hide him. He could hear the creature's labored breathing and the scraping of its fingers as it searched for him. Each second felt like an eternity. Then, silence. Sam dared to peek out from his hiding spot, and to his horror, the creature was standing just inches away, its dead eyes staring directly at him. In one final, desperate move, Sam grabbed a chair and swung it at the creature. To his shock, it passed right through, as if the thing wasn't real at all. But the whispers continued. "Stay. Forever. Stay." Suddenly, the diner's door burst open, and a gust of cold wind rushed in. The creature's form began to dissipate, its grotesque figure unraveling like smoke in the wind. Sam, gasping for breath, stumbled out into the night, collapsing onto the asphalt. When he looked back, the diner was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. Sam drove off, his hands shaking, unable to comprehend what had just happened. But as he pulled into a gas station miles down the road, he noticed something chilling. The gas station's TV was playing a news segment about Lenny's Diner, a place that had burned down 30 years ago after a series of mysterious deaths. The last person to have seen it was never seen again. Sam never spoke of that night, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever was inside that diner was waiting, and it would return. There was a diner off Route 46, buried in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't on any map, but travelers always seemed to find it, especially those desperate for a warm meal after long, lonely drives. The place was called the Midnight Diner, and it was known for its hearty meals, affordable prices, and an odd but charming waitress named Martha, who seemed to have worked there forever. But no one knew the dark secret that lurked within its walls. It was a cold, rainy night when Caleb, a trucker who had been on the road for hours, spotted the neon sign flickering through the fog. The Midnight Diner, open 24/7. Hungry and exhausted, he pulled his rig into the small gravel parking lot, surprised that the diner looked eerily empty despite its open sign. But in his fatigue, he didn't think much of it. All he needed was a meal and some coffee to get him through the night. As soon as he stepped inside, a wave of warmth and the smell of frying bacon greeted him. The diner had an old-school charm with checkered floors and vinyl booths. The only thing that felt off was the quietness. It wasn't completely deserted. Martha stood behind the counter with a warm smile, and in the corner, a man sat at a booth, face hidden behind a newspaper. "Sit anywhere you'd like, hon," Martha said with a thick southern drawl, handing Caleb a menu. "Coffee?" "Yeah, please," Caleb muttered, choosing a booth near the window. He scanned the menu. It was simple but comforting. Burgers, sandwiches, pancakes. Everything was priced ridiculously low for today's standards. He was about to settle on a burger when he noticed something odd about the menu. In the corner, there was an item listed as the last meal. No description, just a price, $5.55. "What's this last meal about?" Caleb asked as Martha approached with his coffee. Her smile faltered for a moment, her eyes glinting with something he couldn't quite place. "Oh, that's just an old joke. Ain't no one ever orders it. Folks who do, well, they don't usually come back." Caleb chuckled, thinking it was part of the diner's quirky personality. "Well, I'll take the burger then." Martha nodded, disappearing into the kitchen. As he waited, Caleb noticed the man in the corner. He hadn't moved an inch since Caleb had entered, and his newspaper hadn't rustled. An eerie stillness surrounded him. Minutes later, Martha returned with his meal, an incredibly juicy burger with a side of crispy fries. Caleb dug in, grateful for the nourishment. But halfway through, he began to feel strange. His head swam and his vision blurred slightly. He chalked it up to exhaustion. Suddenly, the lights in the diner flickered, and the air seemed to grow heavier, almost suffocating. Caleb looked around, noticing that the man with the newspaper was gone. Only his paper remained, lying flat on the booth as though it had never been touched. "Where'd he go?" Caleb asked Martha. Martha tilted her head, confused. "Who, Han?" "The guy sitting in the corner." "Honey, you're the only one here," she replied, her voice dripping with an unnatural sweetness. A chill ran down Caleb's spine. He was sure there had been someone else in the diner. Uneasy, he finished his meal quickly and paid at the counter. As he handed her the money, her smile widened unnaturally. "You be careful out there, Han. The road's full of surprises at this hour." Caleb nodded and left, eager to get back on the road. But as soon as he stepped outside, he felt a crushing sense of déjà vu. The diner's parking lot was different. His truck wasn't where he had left it. In fact, the entire place seemed off. The sky was darker, and the air had an electric charge. Panic rising, Caleb turned around to look at the diner, only to see that it was boarded up, windows shattered, the neon sign hanging by a single wire flickering weakly. He stumbled back, heart pounding. The diner hadn't looked like this when he entered. Was this some kind of sick joke? His breath quickened as he realized his phone had no signal. The rain was pouring now, each drop cold and sharp as it hit his skin. A low growl broke through the storm. Caleb turned and saw what he initially thought was a stray dog, but as it crept closer, he realized it wasn't a dog at all. Its eyes glowed red, its skin pale and stretched over its skeletal frame. It let out another guttural growl, its mouth dripping with something thick and dark. Caleb ran, his boots splashing through the muddy gravel, but no matter how fast he moved, the creature was always right behind him. He could feel its hot breath on his neck, its claws scraping the ground mere inches away. Just as he thought it would pounce, a bright light cut through the fog. A truck was coming down the road. Caleb waved frantically, screaming for help. The truck stopped, and a man leaned out of the window. "You all right there, buddy?" the driver asked. Caleb glanced behind him. The creature was gone. Shaking, he nodded and climbed into the truck, his heart still racing. I don't know what happened. The diner, it wasn't." The driver chuckled. "The midnight diner, right? Yeah, it does that to people." Caleb stared at him, wide-eyed. "What do you mean?" The driver's smile faded. "That diner's been closed for years, burned down with the waitress still inside. Some say if you find it, you're lucky to leave." Caleb's blood ran cold. He looked out the window, but the diner was gone, as though it had never been there. He was back on the dark, empty road with only the rain for company.